Welcome to Marx 913. And a special welcome to our two guests, Michael Hardt and Sandro Mezzadra. It's a special honor to have you both with us here for this session on Marx's Grundrisse and Tony Negri's Marx Beyond Marx lessons on the Grundrisse. It's really a special honor, particularly because you both worked so closely with our dear friend and colleague, Tony Negri, for decades. And in your presence, I feel Tony's presence in the room as well, who we all miss so dearly. So in preparation for this evening, I was rereading Tony's several books, but also Marx in Movement, where I did come across this lovely passage where he mentions both of you and your work. He's discussing the history of workerism, and he takes you through the 1960s and through the 70s and through the 80s, away from the Eurocentric to a broader perspective to the 1990s, the third phase of the workerist development in the 1980s and 1990s, and then he refers, and then there were the studies of Michael Hardt, Sandro Mezzadra, and Brett Nielsen on global migration, international dimension of the class struggle with multiplications that were now becoming viral. So it was a nice way to kind of set the stage as I was reading this for today. And of course, it's also in this context, in this book, in one of the pieces, for instance, in many of these pieces, that the Grundrisse comes up again, right? At which Tony Negri talks about the importance of the Grundrisse to his thinking and to his trajectory, and the different ways in which, you know, I mean, there's this beautiful passage where he speaks about the different texts of Marx that were important to the workerist movement, and how he started in, he says, with the volume 3 of the Capital on the analysis of globalization, then to volume 1, and then actually he starts with volume 2, 3, 1, and then the Grundrisse, where he says the historical theme of the subjectivation of struggles is the principal starting point of the analysis. And of course, he also speaks about it elsewhere when he's talking about Tronti's book, Workers and Capital, right? Where he writes, you know, in this continuity of Marxist thought between youth and maturity, in the interweaving of philosophical and historical writings, and between all of these and the Capital, one finds a special political conception of labor power that functions as a picklock for every theoretical solution, which he finds in the Grundrisse. So we turn to this text, of course, after having taken the historical trajectory to 1857, 1858 now, where we stand, a historical trajectory that's really brought us into the philosophical sides, into the historical work, right? And now gradually into the more strictly kind of scientific economic work. And this particular text is the one that bridges in an interesting way, as we're going to talk about today, that bridges. And that, in a way, becomes the urtext for those readers of Marx who wanted to infuse the more scientific Capital work with the earlier philosophical, political, and social theoretic Marx of the 1840s. And so what's so interesting about being at this point in Marx 1313 is that you really feel that you're at this juncture with the Grundrisse, where you're finding all of the themes coming into confrontation with the book's Capital. It has this way of kind of tying the future economic work back to all of those other elements that we've been studying all semester. And it's also been particularly appreciated by those who have found that the Capital and the work in those volumes was somewhat demobilizing politically, at least perceived as being demobilizing politically. And someone like Tony Negri, possibly, we'll talk about that, who may have felt that way. So it was of particular appeal to those who would prefer to emphasize the political dimensions of the struggle between labor and capital. And you get a really good sense of it, of course, in Marx Beyond Marx. A beautiful sense of it, as we're going to see today, with these exclamations of Tony Negri. Okay, so it's a real privilege to have you both here to do this work with us. Michael, you also co-authored important works with Negri, including Empire, Commonwealth, Multitude, and Assembly, all of which we have learned from greatly. You and Sandro have also co-authored important work, as well as recently the book on Bolivia, Bolivia Beyond the Impasse. And Sandro, of course, you've written many pieces, including the most recent book out of Verso that came out in 2024, The West and the Rest, Capital and Power in Multipolar Worlds. So welcome to both of you. We're thrilled to have you with us. And you're going to be dividing your presentations a little bit back and forth, but starting with you, Michael. So why don't you kick us off? And thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Oh, sorry, I need to turn this off. Okay, good. You can hear me okay. Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Thanks for you all for coming. I can tell that some of you are a bit soggy, and so that, yeah, all the more thanks for that. Yeah, so Sandro and I, our plan is to go back and forth maybe 15 minutes each for 2 rounds. The first ones are really introductions. As I see it, in somewhat anti-chronological order, I'm tasked with introducing Tony's Marx Beyond Marx, and then Sandro will introduce the Grundrisse, and then we each have some specific themes that go through both books that, yeah, that might get more into the content. But we thought we should start pedagogically, you know, with the with introducing the books. One thing I mentioned in the introductory text for the seminar is that in some ways we could put the 2 books together as both being addressed to crises. You know, of course, Marx's Grundrisse is addressing a crisis of global capital in 1857. In some ways, that marks the book. Tony's referring in some ways to a double crisis of Marxism in the mid-1970s. I should say also sort of pedagogically, so Tony's book results from lectures he gave at the École Normale Supérieure in 1978 at Althusser's invitation. And what I see is the double crisis of Marxism that Tony's addressing, like that the Grundrisse allows him to address here in the mid-1970s, is in part a crisis of official Marxism, which I'll explain a bit more later, but I'd see this at least in 2 related registers. One is a crisis of the reading of Capital, insofar as Capital is both perceived as in its objective and scientific nature, and that the Grundrisse, as I'll explain a little bit later, what Tony sees it as a more subjective and referring to subversion and antagonism, rather than just the analysis of Capital. But that's closely related to at least a perception of the crisis of the Italian Communist Party and official Marxism in that sense. And I'll talk a little bit in the second moment about what the refusal of work, how they drive, Tony and others drive the notion of the refusal of work from the Grundrisse, and how that in a way is meant as you know, both something that emerges from the workers' movement, but something that distinguishes the version of Marxism from the official Marxism of the day. The other crisis, though, is I see that Tony's trying to address with the Grundrisse and trying to address in the mid-70s in general, is a crisis of the revolutionary movements in Italy and the place of Marx and Marxism within them. the way I see that, this is something else also that I'll go into a little bit more detail in my second round, I guess, which is in some ways the slogan or the way of conceiving it in the mid-1970s among the movements that Tony was participating in was the end of the centrality of the industrial worker. In other words, and Tony, of course, had been very closely involved with the workers' movements, autonomous workers' movements, and with organizing parties that were aimed at this, the centrality of the industrial worker. By the mid-1970s, there was a crisis of these movements. I mean, there was a result of the revolutionary or liberation movements themselves, feminist movement in first regard, but also student movements of the unemployed, gay liberation movement in Italy. And so that in some ways, a crisis of Marxism in its ability to grasp the nature of the movements at the time by the mid-1970s. And in some ways, a rereading of Marx, this is some ways which I want to try to emphasize the shift that Tony is trying to work with in the Grundrisse is finding a way for Marx to, in Marx's text, to move beyond the centrality of the industrial worker as the primary representative of a revolutionary struggle. Yeah, what I mean, I should stop. What I mean, or what I understand them meaning by the end of the centrality of the industrial worker is the end of the ability of industrial workers to lead but also represent all elements of the revolutionary struggle. I mean, it's not peculiar to Italy, of course, in years previous to this, but this was certainly also part of the struggles in Italy. Okay, then there are just two characteristics of approaches of Tony's reading that I wanted to emphasize here. One is a summary ways in which he's proposing the Grundrisse in contrast to Capital, and the second is what he means by beyond Marx of the title. Still quite just introductory in this one. It might be counterintuitive that a draft is posed as superior to the final book, because the Grundrisse, of course, is one of the drafts of Capital that then, 10 years later, is the published version. And Tony claims that the Grundrisse allows us to read Capital correctly, or read it differently, but he says correctly. In other words, what he's most interested in is the way that the Grundrisse restores antagonism and subversion to the text, that it breaks the scientific legitimation that Capital tries to pose. So one example of that we get from the Grundrisse right off is, in contrast to Volume 1 of Capital, the Grundrisse starts with a chapter on money, not with the commodity. And so this skipping over of the commodity is something that he interprets. You might remember, I mean, he's not the only one, it's in a very different fashion, but Althusser in For Marx suggests at a certain point that when you read Volume 1 of Capital, you should skip over the first two parts. Skip over all that commodity stuff, because then you get to the real beginning of the book. And that Marx poses the commodity as the first appearance, is in a pedagogical way. Our first experience of capital is in the commodity. I should be able to recount the first sentence for you. So one of you can do it too. Somehow in capitalist societies, appears as a world of, oh shit, I should be able to do that. One of you can do it for me. But that's what the beginning is. And instead, what Tony says, what money does instead of the commodity is it reveals an immediate relation of antagonism and control. Yeah, so that rather than us confronting the commodity as the first appearance of capital, what we're struggling against is money, which he claims, is that immediate revelation of the antagonism and the mode of control that we face. Also, capital's categories, in a way, lead to Tony says, an understanding or a basis in private and competitive capital, whereas the Grundrisse's categories immediately address total social capital. In some ways, so starting with money, rather than starting with the commodity, leads us to recognize immediately total social capital as the object, rather than the individual capital that produces the specific commodities. Okay, as you can see, quite basic, or quite introductory. That's the first point about in one way in which the Grundrisse appears superior, and a better introduction, than Capital Volume 1. What Tony means by beyond Marx, it could be just summarized with Fred Jameson's mandate to always historicize. That we need to read Marx's work both in the context of the conjuncture in which he's writing, but we need to read it forward into the contemporary context and what we're facing. So that we need to take Marx's categories and Marx's hypotheses and translate them and resituate them in our contemporary world. Specifically, he claims that there was a lag of workers' organization in Marx's conjuncture. That in some ways, Marx's theory was blocked, and his revolutionary theory in particular is blocked by the lack of development of workers' organization. And instead, today, meaning 1978, when he's doing these lectures, he proposed that capitalist development and workers' organization have both matured. And so in that way, we can read beyond what Marx could, a kind of fulfillment of his project and of his hypotheses. So historicizing then is not only reading Marx in his own time, but also carrying his concepts and his arguments forward to our contemporary period, so that Tony can write it toward the end of the book, that what we need is a project for today, still based on a theory of Marx. And that's what I'll come back to, at least one element that I'll come back to in the next entry. So now pass to Sandro.
Thanks, Michael. All right, Sandro, turn it on. There you go.
So it's up to me to introduce the Grundrisse, defined by David Harvey, by far the most interesting and the most difficult book by Marx to work with. Indeed, the Grundrisse is not a book, but rather 7 notebooks written by Marx between October 1857 and spring 1858. So yet another unpublished manuscript by Marx. It is amazing the kind of disproportion that you face in Marx between what he wrote and what he published. The famous 1857 introduction was indeed published by Karl Kautsky in 1903, but the whole manuscript came out only in 1939, 1941 in Moscow, and remained basically unnoticed due to the war, to the Second World War. So the real reception of the Grundrisse started only with its publication in East Berlin in 1953. And it became particularly intense in the 1960s with the publication of 2 classical commentaries of the Grundrisse, one by Vitaly Vygotsky and one by Roman Rosdolsky. Since then, the Grundrisse has become a crucial terrain for new, creative, and heterodox readings of Marx. And it is fair to say that these readings have turned the Grundrisse into a full-fledged book. So the Grundrisse as a book emerged more than 100 years after Marx wrote the 7 notebooks that compose it. Fragments of the Grundrisse were made available in several languages before the complete publication of the work. Of course, the 1857 introduction, but also the fragment on machines that was published in the Italian workerist journal Quaderni Rossi. Tony was part of the editorial committee, and pre-capitalist economic formations that came out in English from international publishers with a foreword by Eric Hobsbawm. So the history of the translations, the dissemination, and the reception of the Grundrisse in the world, well beyond the West, is indeed amazing. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, in many parts of the world, the Grundrisse were taken as a kind of living text to reinvent Marxism, or even to go beyond Marxism. Nonetheless, it is important to note that today we face a quite different situation, and I think it is helpful to say a couple of words about this different situation. First of all, with respect to the corpus, to the body of Marx's work. The status of the Grundrisse has been, in a way, altered over recent decades, and its definition as a book has been challenged. This is because the new critical edition of Marx and Engels' works, the Mega 2, has brought to light a whole sea of manuscripts, in particular the 1861-63 and the 1863-65 manuscripts, within which the distinctiveness of the Grundrisse tends to fade. So while there is much to learn, of course, from this philological work, there is also a need, I think, to ask whether we do not risk to miss something relevant in this kind of dismissal of the Grundrisse as a book, I repeat, fabricated by the work of a multitude of readers on Marx's notebooks of 1857-58. Moreover, in contemporary literature on Marx, critical tones on the Grundrisse abound. Think of Kohei Saito's critique of the Prometheanism that, according to him, characterizes the Grundrisse. Or think of the scheme of unilinear historical development that, according to many readers, also characterizes the Grundrisse. For people like Michael Heinrich or other representatives of the so-called Neue Marx Lektüre, new reading of Marx, in the Grundrisse we kind of face an unaccomplished and still fragmentary theory of value. It is, I think, against this background that we need to ask whether it still makes sense to insist on the Grundrisse as a single work, as a book, and whether reading it continues to provide us with critical flashes of inspiration to continue to develop in our present the Marxian project of a critique of political economy. And our answers are affirmative, as you can guess, because otherwise we would not be here. First important point is that there is a principle of unity behind the Grundrisse, behind Marx's plan in the Grundrisse. And this principle of unity is provided by Marx's response to the first world crisis of capitalism in 1857. Marx was living in very dire, tough conditions in London in the mid-1850s. Nonetheless, he was kind of euphoric in front of the crisis, this wonderful crisis, as he writes to his friend Friedrich Engels. So the Grundrisse are also kind of document of the way in which Marx reacted to the crisis, a kind of document of the way in which he provided a political reading of the crisis as an opportunity for a new revolutionary movement. And this explains also the peculiarity of Marx's focus on the money form and on the world market in the Grundrisse. This is theoretically a very important point. Michael already expanded on money. The world market, I will arc back to this in my second round, is a kind of counterpoint to the money form. And the critique of political economy that emerges in the field of tension between the money form and the world market is a very peculiar theoretical and political formation. Theoretical and political formation. As Michael was saying, one of the main points made by Tony in Marx Beyond Marx is precisely that the Grundrisse is a political text. Tony was not alone in making this point. Many other readers of the Grundrisse underscored this political dimension of the text. For instance, Enrique Dussel, you know, that in many ways is far from Tony with respect to his training, to his experience. But he makes the same point with respect to what both Dussel and Tony call the discovery of surplus value. The discovery of surplus value is behind the money form and the word market, the main axis of the critique of political economy articulated by Marx in the Grundrisse. Both Tony and Dussel invite us to read the Grundrisse not simply as a preparatory manuscript for capital. I think this is an important point today because there are many readers who contend that the Grundrisse and Capital are two different projects. That the Grundrisse was part of a project that Marx substantially altered and even abandoned in the early 1860s when he started to write the first volume of Capital. Be it as it is, maybe we can discuss about this reading. The Grundrisse remains a crucially important crystal of theory. And I think that we can, in a way, reframe the relation between the Grundrisse and Capital as it was presented by Tony. Michael explained that, in a way, Tony, for conjunctural and political reasons, was playing the Grundrisse against Capital. But maybe today, rather than positioning the Grundrisse against Capital, we can use the Grundrisse for a new reading of Capital. We can reread Capital from the angle provided by the Grundrisse, from the political angle provided by the Grundrisse, which means from the point of view of class struggle. From the point of view of class struggle that is so crucial in the theoretical, in the conceptual fabric of the Grundrisse, and that is sometimes kind of lost, or that sometimes fades in Capital Volume 1.
Okay. I'm back. Okay, good. There we go. So I wanted to continue on this in the same framework that I mentioned before. First, delving a bit deeper into the question about the crisis of Marxism and the way that the Grundrisse for Tony provides a basis for getting beyond the crisis of official Marxism, let's say. And then a second moment about how the Grundrisse allows Tony to address the crisis of the movements in the 1970s, which might have some meaning for us today, which I'm hoping it could. So what I mean by the crisis of official Marxism, well, what I'm thinking of in particular is the concept and slogan of the refusal of work as functioning in this realm. So this is something that was already existent within the Italian workerist movement in operaismo, as Bernard mentioned in Mario Tronti's book, Workers and Capital, already published in 1966. This is already one of the slogans and analyses. And I would say through the 1960s, even in the party that Tony was involved with, Potere Operaio, Workers' Power, what the refusal of work primarily meant, well, here we go with the slogan against official Marxism, went something like this. So, against the liberation of work that the official Marxism associated with, as if liberation was about the liberation of work, we need instead a liberation from work. So, the refusal of work functions that way, maybe at the largest ideological level, but also practically within the workers' movement. The refusal of work involved strikes as a refusal of work, sabotage, slowdowns, etc., all forms of ways in which the workers' weapons were understood in terms of a refusal of work. This notion of the refusal of work, though, it seems to me, remains strictly worker-centered. And that I think, this is at least part of my hypothesis, and this is that Tony needed to engage a wider range of movements to interpret the same concepts, and I guess slogans too, in a way that reached beyond the class struggle of the industrial working class. Let's put it that way. At a certain point, he says in the Marx, Beyond Marx, that communism involves the shift from the liberation from work to going beyond work. Yeah, so let me read a passage of the Grundrisse that he interprets in this regard, and I thought it might be helpful to actually do some passages of this. I'm on page 325 in the English edition, but oh yeah, so many of you even have a book. Okay, I'm like 2/3 the way down the page of 325. A sentence starts: "Capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labor beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is all-sided in its production as in its consumption, and whose labor also therefore appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself." Like, maybe I should just stop right there. The notion of that the labor appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself. Here, what the element in the Grundrisse that Tony's pointing towards here, and that is developed, I'm actually going to point to a couple other passages about this, which involves primarily the creation of new needs, like the understanding of wealth, and even a reconception of activity in terms of the creation, of a different form of wealth and in its relationship to new needs. Also, in a passage like this, it's a classic Marx element of the ways in which capitalist development points beyond capital itself. And so this is trying to grasp one of those elements. So the refusal of work here is not just about wage labor, but is meant to reveal the wealth of the proletarian world as a whole. Like, that's what I'm trying to get from this. As you can see, I mean, maybe if you just wanted to stick with the critique of official Marxism, that the initial slogan could help with that. You know, just instead of a liberation of work, we're talking about a liberation from work. But then I wanted to point to this further step, it seems to me, that Tony's trying to work through the Grundrisse, which is that it's not only a liberation from work, but a liberation that points toward the proletarian world as a whole, rather than only the industrial worker's position within it. Okay, so then I can do that better with regard to what I was posing as my second framework, which was the crisis of the movements, which, as I said before, it's another aspect of Tony's work end of Marx's work too, which is that, I mean, it's always conjunctural, but maybe this is what I meant by historicize earlier. I mean, so even though he's reading the Grundrisse, what he's interpreting is what the needs of the movements today are. And as I said, the notion of the end of the centrality of the industrial worker, which one could interpret both in terms of a lament or a celebration, but nonetheless a reality. The end of the centrality of the industrial worker forced or allowed for trying to engage a wider network of struggles that were being forced onto the scene. I mean, so even just in material terms, that Potere Operaio, the party that Tony was involved with, dissolved itself in 1973, at large part because of the refusals of the feminist movement to continue along the same lines. So what I'm thinking then is that one of Tony's attempts in this book, this is the way, is partly my, I don't think I'm imposing this on him, but the way I'm trying to bring out, is to read the possibility of a form of struggle that Marx is making possible that goes beyond wage labor as subject, or an industrial worker as subject. A movement is a many-sided network, which includes, of course, the class struggle in its traditional forms, but now also extends well beyond it. So, yeah, as I said, I think what Tony, this is how I'm interpreting his insistence in this book that communism be understood, or he's reading in this in the Grundrisse, that Marx is understanding communism as a new conception of wealth, and which is closely related to the notion of the creation of new needs. Let me try a couple passages that I find useful for this, from the Grundrisse again. So one is on page 287, toward the top of the page, maybe starting on the third line. And I'm starting in the middle of a sentence. As all of you know, engage with the Grundrisse, so you always have to read fragments. The sentences never quite maintain as whole sentences, etc. But what I'm starting with is after this parenthesis on the third line. And the worker's participation in the higher, even cultural satisfaction, the agitation for his own interests, newspaper subscriptions, attending lectures, educating his children, developing his tastes, etc. His only share of civilization, which distinguishes him from the slave, is economically only possible by widening the sphere of his pleasures. I'm attracted by this notion of widening the sphere of his pleasures. The first part, you might let that list of agitation for one's own interests, newspaper subscriptions, attending lectures, that resonates with a favorite sentence of mine in the Paris manuscripts in the needs section, where it's one of these strange long lists about dancing, smoking, going to theater, reading. Someone else can do that line for me too. It ends up with loving, like new more forms of loving, etc. And I think this is what I'm reading as what I said before is that we're not thinking here strictly of the struggle of wage labor, but of the proletarian world as a whole. Widening the sphere of pleasures. Okay, one other's on page 488, and I probably shouldn't point to too many passages, but they're hard not to. And so this one on 488 starts on maybe the fifth line. I think I might even. Oh, I turned off my phone. Never mind. I'll be able to read it. Okay. So it starts here. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form, so 488 starting on the fourth line. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth? Other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, And then we go on. It's the rest of the passage is good too. But the notion of wealth being like in contrast to the wealth that capitalist society poses for us. So when we strip away its bourgeois form, what we have is a notion of wealth, a radically different notion of wealth that's based on the universality of needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc. Yeah, the other passage I would have read, but maybe it's too long, is about understanding labor both as, this is on 295, 296, labor both as universal poverty, because excluded from the forms of wealth in bourgeois society, but also as universal wealth. And this notion of labor as universal wealth, it fits, so I guess there's at least three parts to what I'm trying to point towards here. Wealth, needs, and pleasures. And that is, what I'm hoping is that can help us point to or allow to engage with a series of struggles that are not only the ones of the industrial workers. That it can, of course, would include that, and he's certainly talking about it, but something that goes beyond it. Here, since we have several excellent Foucauldians in the room, I would be interested in the for the discussion thinking about, so right in the same year, 1978, elsewhere in Paris, Foucault at the time, in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, says that the rallying point for a counterattack will be bodies and pleasures, rather enigmatically. But I'm trying to think, it would be interesting, first of all, Foucault himself, in a different way than Tony, is very sensitive to the nature of movements going on at the time. But I've often had trouble with that passage, not trouble with that passage in the History of Sexuality, not trouble with it like I disagree with it, trouble with it like, what the hell does he mean by that? Like, how could we fill that in? And so I'm wondering if perhaps the pleasures that Tony's finding here in the Grundrisse as the basis of a new form of wealth, even as the basis of struggle, and the counterattack that Foucault is proposing in terms of bodies and pleasures, that perhaps there's something that could be related among those two. I don't think that Foucault was reading the Grundrisse at the time. I don't think that Tony was attending Foucault's lectures or even reading his book at the time. But I'm wondering if perhaps there's something in the air in 1978, in the interpretation of what the movements were doing, that puts these two together. That's where I was going. So, right, communism as a new form of wealth characterized by the expansions of needs and pleasures. How, the question that poses for me, remember, so when Tony says, toward the end of the book, what I quoted earlier, which is, how do we make this a project for today, still based on the theory of Marx, but engaging with our theory today? I guess what I'm proposing is that Tony is trying to bring Marx's theory into the world of movements that are not exclusively defined by class struggle in its traditional forms. So that what he refers to in the passage I didn't read on, 488, about the non-objectified activity of the proletarian world. So I guess what I would want, like maybe I'm just proposing as a possibility for discussion for us, is if in our context, or what I think is going on in 1978 for Tony, is trying to move away from a class-first position while not abandoning class struggle. And I think that if we were to try to say, because it would be our job, it would be my and Sandro's job, I'm not sure if we're actually going to come through with this, which would be what do we make it for whatever today is, 2025? What politically does this mean for us? Today, it seems to me, seems to me a minor point, perhaps, but since one certainly can't fault Tony for not being dedicated to class struggle. He seems like an excellent person to contest what I interpret as a recent resurgence among some friends on the left of an insistence on class first perspective. And I guess what I mean by that is those who say, I hope I'm not caricaturing it, say yes, of course, feminist struggles are important, race struggles are important, but the most important struggle is against capital and is of the working class. I think that what Tony is providing here is something that's struggling against that, and he's an excellent person to do it because his credentials of commitment to class struggle cannot be. So it's not as if Tony's abandoning class struggle or anything like that, but he's trying to expand it, like I said, to the entire wealth of the proletarian world. That's the way what it's posed here. I pass to Sandro.
Needless to say, there are many passages in the Grundrisse that are fascinating and that would deserve close reading tonight. Just think of the famous fragment on the machines. I will focus on just two issues that I already mentioned before and that I find particularly important for us today. The first issue is the notion of the world market that is developed in the Grundrisse in ways that you do not find in other works. The second is precisely the question of class struggle, and I will ask myself whether in the Grundrisse we can find on the one hand a kind of radical focus on class struggle as a principle of method, and on the other hand, kind of understanding of class struggle that goes beyond the traditional one. Let me start with the world market, with the concept of world market. The world market takes center stage in Marx's critical understanding of capitalism since his early works, in particular the German ideology, and of course the Communist Manifesto. But in the Grundrisse, even more than in Capital, it builds the overarching conceptual, no less than spatial framework of Marx's analysis. The world market works in the Grundrisse as the abstract principle of unification of capital's operations, an abstract principle that corresponds to the abstract nature of money. Let me quote a short passage, page 227, 228 of the English edition.
227, 228.
Yes. Where Marx writes that the world market necessarily forms the conclusion of the whole system, in which production is posited as a totality, together with all its moments, but within which, at the same time, all contradictions come into play. The world market, Marx concludes here, forms the presupposition of the whole as well as its substratum. This is a point on which Tony expands in Marx beyond Marx. There is one chapter, chapter 6, that is entirely dedicated to the world market. There would be, of course, much more to say on the world market in the Grundrisse, but for want of time, allow me to try to clarify Marx's Hegelian jargon, the precondition as well as the substratum, the precondition as well as the result, he writes elsewhere, by bringing up a single, short, and dense quote taken from page 408. I repeat, it is a short quote, but conceptually very dense.
The tendency to create?
Yes.
So it starts on about the 12th line of 408.
The tendency to create the world market, Marx writes here, is directly given in the concept of capital itself. Every limit appears as an obstacle to be overcome. I think that there is, first of all, a need to emphasize that the creation of the world market appears as a tendency whose deployment since the early years of the capitalist mode of production is continuously characterized by capital's encounter with limits and borders. Remember that the word used by Marx for limit, Grenze, also designates geopolitical boundaries. These limits and borders, Marx writes, have to be converted into obstacles to be overcome. It's a kind of dialectic of limit and obstacle that grasps a very important aspect of capital's operations. While the world market is even conceptually the necessary horizon of capital's operations, it has to be again and again fabricated through this dialectic of limit and obstacle. A dialectic that Marx employs also elsewhere in the Grundrisse to grasp the logic of capital. Of course, one of the main questions implicitly raised here regards the role of political and territorial actors in opening up and organizing the world market, in enabling capital to turn limits into obstacles. This is, I think, in a nutshell, a sketch of a theory of imperialism, which sounds particularly challenging today, in a moment in which the world market appears disrupted and several actors are working to reorganize it through violence and war. Let me come to the second issue I want to briefly discuss. we anticipated while speaking of the Grundrisse as a political text, that class antagonism works here as a principle of method. This is, for me, particularly important. A principle of method that guides the formulation of the basic concepts of the critique of political economy, starting with the discovery of surplus value. I think that in order to get a sense of Marx's understanding of class antagonism, but also to recover his emphasis on class struggle for the present, it is important to discuss a notion that is particularly important in the Grundrisse, which means the notion of living labor. I quote again a short passage, page 272, the only thing distinct, if you can find it.
Yeah. Give me a second.
Of course.
yes, the third line.
Okay, easy. So the only thing distinct from objectified labor, Marx writes, is non-objectified labor. Labor which is still objectifying itself. Labor as subjectivity, as the living subject in which labor exists as a capacity, as a possibility, hence as worker. As you can imagine, this idea of labor of subjectivity figures quite prominently in Tony's reading of the Grundrisse. Labor as subjectivity, living subject in which labor exists as capacity, as possibility, hence as worker. Of course, we have learned, Michael was saying that, to problematize the figure of the worker and the related Marxian notion of productive labor. But when Marx writes that the negation of capital, the real non-capital is labor, he formulates what seems to me, I repeat, a methodic principle that continues to be relevant today. Moreover, in the Grundrisse, we can find a kind of connection between this emphasis on living labor and communism that is worth rethinking. Of course, Marx does not expand on the contours of communism in the Grundrisse. He does not provide any recipes for the restaurants of the future, as he writes in the preface to Capital. Nonetheless, in the Grundrisse, he lays the ground for a theory of transition. This is, first of all, because in many passages, he describes the emergence of living labor as a subject incompatible with the rule of capital. Secondly, Marx provides at least the sketch of a transition to communism. Page 159 is a bit longer, within bourgeois society.
bottom, 10 lines from the bottom.
So within bourgeois society, Marx writes, the society that rests on exchange value, there arise a relation of circulation as well as of production, which are so many minds to explode it. A mass of antithetical forms of the social unity, whose antithetical character can never be abolished through quiet metamorphosis. A mass of antithetical forms of the social unity whose antithetical character can never be abolished through quiet metamorphosis. A revolution is needed. A political rupture is needed. On the other hand, Marx writes, if we did not find concealed in society as it is the material conditions of production and the corresponding relations of exchange prerequisite for a classless society, then all attempts to explode it would be quixotic. So the question raised here by Marx regards, of course, the vexed question of the productive forces, developed productively by capital until the point in which it becomes a barrier for their development. We know that Marx's understanding of the relation between productive forces and relations of production has been criticized from several points of view, and rightly so, in a way. Negri himself wrote that communism is in no case a product of capitalist development. It is its radical inversion. It is the demystification which becomes the reversal of capitalist development. But such an inversion is impossible without a political rupture and an appropriation of the productive forces developed by capital for a completely different kind of planning. I think that nowadays, precisely in the dark times we are living through, we need to reactivate the imagination of a society beyond the rule of capital. We need to take up again the question of transition, and we even need to reopen our discussion on the notion of productive forces in a situation in which, of course, productive forces are completely different from the ones that Marx was facing at the end of the 1850s. In any case, reading the Grundrisse today from the angle of living labor leads us to recognize this need, to recognize the need to open new horizons of liberation, I repeat, in the dark times we are living through.
Thank you so much, Sandro and Michael, for those brilliant presentations, for the back and forth, for the textual references, and for the opportunity to read together the Grundrisse. All right, so let me start with a few thoughts and some questions, and then we'll open it up. So first of all, didn't expect to be interpolated in terms of.
Why not?
But why not? But and so I've been scrambling to find the passages that might help us here. Okay, and I think I found some. So, as to Foucault on these questions of labor and pleasure that you were raising, which are really important questions in Marx, but also in Foucault, I think this would be a situation again where there was a bit of a missed opportunity, I think, for a conversation. We can have a larger conversation. Stuart Eldon is here, Guillaume Leblanc is here, so we can and Jessica, we can have a much larger conversation about this. But I feel, in a sense, it might be one of these places where there was a slightly missed opportunity, the way in which he spoke sometimes of the missed opportunity with the Frankfurt School. And the reason I'm thinking that is that, of course, the Grundrisse was a very young text in the early 1970s, as we were mentioning, right? And so there are these passages where Foucault directly criticizes a certain reading of Marx, whereby, as he suggests, the essence of the human being, say, or species being, is tied to labor, right? And there's a way in which I think the missing opportunity were the specific passages that you were reading, Michael, from the Grundrisse, perhaps. Now, and so the passages I'm thinking about, of course, are the ones in The Punitive Society, in the lecture of March 28th, 1973, where Foucault is specifically, in a way, building on this idea that it's an illusion to think of the essence of man, human beings, as being labor. And what he tries to suggest, of course, is that that itself was the result of an entire, fabrication of knowledge and power to get to the point where we would believe that labor was so essential to our conception of man. And he writes, this is on March 28th, 1973, or he lectures on March 28th, 1973. It's on page 232, and I think that's of the English edition. He writes, "It is false to say with certain famous post-Hegelians that labor is man's concrete existence. The time and life of man are not labor but nature, by nature. They are not labor by nature. They are pleasure, discontinuity." He says fête, so festivity, rest, need, moments, chance, violence, and so on. Now it is all this explosive energy that needs to be transformed into a continuous labor power continually offered on the market. Life, in this sense, right, of festivity, must be synthesized into labor power. The clever ploy, yes, so this is the English translation. In French, it's the stroke of genius of industrial society was to take up the old technique of the confinement of the poor, which in the classical age was a way of fixing and at the same time suppressing those who through idleness, vagabondage, or revolt had escaped all the geographical fixations in which the exercise of sovereignty was carried out. Right? So in a way, that's kind of like directly kind of responding to the query. Now, and so, one can wonder, and one gets a sense of what he's trying to suggest here is all the work that it took, right, with the Black Acts in England and rules about vagabondage and loitering and closure to create the idea that labor had value. He talks about it again in Truth and Juridical Forms in May 1973 when he goes to Rio, and he writes, he explains, "What I'd like to show is that, in point of fact, labor is absolutely not man's concrete essence or man's existence in its concrete form. it needs the operation or synthesis carried out by a political power for man's essence to appear as being labor, right? And so that's where he then develops these concepts of infra-power, et cetera. And that, of course, is where Foucault and Marx become so complementary in a way. Now, it's a critique. It's intended to be a critique it's intended to be, I mean, on my reading, a supplementing to Marx. I've always thought of it as this conjoining, right? And you see it, of course, in its full articulation in Discipline and Punish, around page 220, when he says, right, the accumulation of capital has to be related to the accumulation of docile bodies, right? And of course, he does that too in Psychiatric Power on November 28, 1973. And there are these passages where it's clear that kind of like the disciplinary processes are intended to create docile bodies that were intended to kind of facilitate the possibility of the accumulation of people related to the accumulation of capital. They are inextricably linked, etc. He writes in the Psychiatric Power, the extension, movement, and migration of the disciplines from their lateral function to the central and general function they exercise from the 18th century are linked to this accumulation of men and to the role of the accumulation of men in capitalist society. So, in a way, I would say the answer is, again, this is a bit of a missed opportunity. It's certainly, I think it would have been fascinating to have the Grundrisse more present at that moment in conversation. It's again the artifact of someone reading another person in a way that the other person would, I mean, when we read another person, always that other person says, no, that's not what I was, that's not, I mean, I was trying to say that. I was trying to say that very thing, right? And so, of course, you could have Marx responding in the Grundrisse that I was trying to say that exact thing. I don't know, it's a perennial problem that we need to resolve somehow as thinkers and in the way in which we communicate with each other's work. But so that's where I would say those are the texts that I would want to put in conversation in response to that question, and it would raise for me a question also about the passage. When you were referring to the passages about labor no longer as labor, I think it was on page 325, but as full development of activity itself. How that then relates to the famous passage about hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon, and doing critique after dinner, right?
It was a joke, by the way.
Okay. All right.
I'm pretty sure that's textually right. That they meant it as an ironic.
Well, we had an interpretation of it a few weeks ago as being
As being serious?
as being serious, yeah, as being a conception of as being a different conception of labor, as being a different conception of labor.
Okay, well, that's
yeah,
good too.
yeah. Okay, so anyway, okay, good. I think that was in the conversation with Sheila Ben Habib on Arendt and the distinctions between work and labor, but maybe we can pursue this more. Okay. So that would be something, and I'd love to hear more from others in the room who are experts on all of this as well. Now, okay, so, but I do want to also kind of build on what you said, to ask questions maybe to further the discussion. And Sandro, one thing that I feel in a lot of the way in which Negri is reading Marx and what he's doing to Marx in terms of finding the class conflict in the Grundrisse so much, right? I asked myself, well, do I want to turn to the Grundrisse for that? Or can I just stick with class conflicts in France and the 18th Brumaire and use those texts instead to help me and to guide me in my thinking today, right? And so that's a big question I have, which, I mean, it doesn't detract from this way of reading the Grundrisse. For me, though, it's just, do I get more traction out of the kind of more historical work from the French Revolution 1848, and possibly from the Commune work on Civil War in 1871, right? Then from kind of the labor of this text, which requires so much work in a way. Okay, so that's my main question, and then well, yeah, I mean, I would want to get your thoughts on the relationship here, possibly to these ideas. Or at least to how Foucault was trying to deal with this, and then I think I'd want a little bit more, maybe from both of you, on kind of actualizing Tony Negri's reading of the Grundrisse today, in a way. Of course, you both have done an enormous amount of work on that, and many of the books that you wrote with Tony were, in a sense, trying to do that exactly. So maybe we could flesh that out a little bit for today. So, those were, I don't know, when did Empire come out? What year was that?
2000.
2000. So yeah, that's 25 years ago. That's like, some of the people in this room weren't born, right? So there's been a lot of water under the bridge. There's been a lot of water under the bridge this week. How could we work on kind of actualizing some of this? You say, Sandro, we need to take up again the questions of transition and productive forces. I mean, so let's take them up for a second and see what we can do concretely now in our time, in the actuality. So, who wants to start? And then we're gonna listen to you, and then we're gonna open it up. So signal to me a little bit while I put on my other glasses so I can see you. Signal to me if you want in. Okay. All right. I see Stuart wants in. Let's go. Actually, do you want in on Foucault right now? No. No. It's not on Foucault. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. Who wants to go first?
I'll just say.
Are you on?
No. Just 2 words about the Foucault thing. I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting work recently about Marx and Foucault that seems very useful. I would say with the kinds of texts that you were pointing to, this, both the Grundrisse, Tony's reading of it, some of these other works can function as a kind of filter, so that we can recognize when Foucault is trying to separate himself from official Marxism, the Marxism of the French Communist Party, the orthodoxy, etc. And if we can filter out that part, then we can see the more interesting part. And so that's what. So in some ways, if you would say, well, Tony and Marx are here arguing against that official thing, we can just sort of. Then we can just filter out that parts of the text. I'm still interested in what revolutionary is understood in the first volume in the history of sexuality, and what the concatenation of resistances would be, and how that relates to this. But that's sort of a slightly separate topic, and I'll leave that for a minute. Why don't you go? I mean, about what today? That's a hard and big one. But if you have a way of starting that, but I bet others will too.
And also the relationship between the Grundrisse and the historical text.
Yeah. Well, that's you. You got that one.
Okay.
Yes, I will try to be short so that we have time for more conversations.
Let me be sure. I think so. Yeah, it's on.
It's clear that there is a lot to learn from class struggles in France, from the 18 Brumaire, from the writings on the Commune, also with respect to class and class struggle. But what I think is particularly important is to develop the primacy of class struggle in operaismos terms in the conceptual work. And this is what the Grundrisse allows to do. Of course, Tony was overemphasizing this aspect of the Grundrisse, but this aspect is present. When Marx writes of labor as the real and only non-capital, he is describing an antagonistic relation. And he is doing that not in an historical work, but rather within an attempt to build concepts for the critique of political economy. So it is precisely this relation between the materiality of class struggle writ large, of course, and the labor of concepts that I think is important today, is important for us today. And the Grundrisse is a crucial source of inspiration from this point of view. And then actualizing Tony. You know, Tony passed away in December 2023, and he continued to write until the very end of his life. So he continued to try to actualize his own thinking. And what was really striking in Tony is that, I repeat, until the end of his life, he was never satisfied with his accomplishments. He never celebrated himself. He was always looking for new sources of knowledge. He was very curious. He was always in search of the possibility of antagonism and revolution. You know. And this is really amazing in a man of his age that had accomplished quite a lot in his long, dense, complicated, and full life. You know. But then let's go back to Tony as a reader of Marx. Tony developed a kind of style of reading Marx in the 1960s that remained his own style until the end. And you can understand the peculiarity of this style if you think of other important interpretations of Marx in the 1950s and 60s in Europe. If you think of the Frankfurt School, if you think of Althusser, for instance. What characterized Tony was precisely the emphasis on the potentiality of labor. The emphasis on the potentiality of labor. And he was arguing that in order to understand capital, you have to start from the potentiality of labor. The potentiality of labor that is subjugated, that is exploited, of course, but nonetheless can always be at the same time non-capital, as in the Grundrisse. in a way, this was at the root of the optimism that has often been criticized in Tony. It nurtured a specific form of critique of capitalism, very far away from any left melancholia. For instance, Tony could not really stand the notion of alienation as it had been developed, in particular within the Frankfurt School. Because alienation, in his eyes, was purely negative. He couldn't grasp this potentiality of labor within theories of alienation. I think that this style of reading Marx, this peculiar form of critique of capitalism is relevant today. Is relevant today because it invites us to get out of a position of mere resistance. And this is the reason why I brought the notion of transition, being aware of the fact that, times are dark. I'm not particularly optimistic, but I think that in order to struggle in these dark times, we need to forge new horizons of relation. This is something that I see in a line of continuity with.
So let me open it up. I have Stuart Eldon has got a question first. I've got Guillaume Leblanc as well. So Stuart, why don't you start? And
thank you. It's to pick up on something that Michael said, that I know that Bernard also talks about in his introduction to this seminar. And it's about the particular context in which Tony Negri is giving these lectures in Paris in 1978. And you said it's the Althusser's seminar at the ANS. And I'm thinking, well, if you wanted to challenge Althusser's developmental reading of Marx and the break, the best text to use is the Grundrisse, because it just complicates, at best, all that Althusser has tried to say in that developmental sense of Marx. But I wonder, can we go further in terms of contextualizing that in French debates in Marxism as well? Henri Lefebvre's book on the state, the fourth volume, the final volume, has been published in 1978. And that's a text that, in a sense, is a filling in of another part of what Marx is trying to do in the bigger project of which capital, on one plan at least, is a part. What Balabar's done with the dictatorship of the proletariat just a couple of years before. I'm also wondering about Tony Negri's meeting with Felix Guattari, which must be around this time, mid to late 70s. And then the Deleuze and Guattari perhaps is a way of thinking and linking back to what Bernard was talking about with Foucault, because I'd seen the pleasures line in Foucault as partly a critique of the desire line that he finds in some of the other people writing. So the context of the writing, I'm sorry to take it away from the present conjuncture, but I'm thinking, what is Tony Negri doing in these lectures to engage with debates in France, particularly in the late 70s?
I don't think I have a good answer, but that's an excellent question. I mean, but I don't think that's important. The historical part of it, whether he was intending to respond to Althusser's epistemological break or Lefebvre's work or other aspects of French Marxism at the time, I'm just not sure about that. Yeah, but that seems like a really interesting. That seems like a really interesting question to me. Yeah, I don't have a good response.
So I reached out to Etienne Balibar to kind of, because I was particularly interested in that, in the absence the Grundrisse, right? And so he wrote back. I can share what he said. I'm sure Etienne would. I'm sure. He says, well, Musto, un peu trop agressif. Il lit un peu trop simplement la thèse. So he's a little bit too aggressive in reading simply the thesis of la coupure épistémologique, putting aside the rectifications that Althusser himself had brought to it. But sur le fond, all in all, he's not exactly wrong. It's true that Althusser, and as a consequence, ourselves, his students, we had neglected the Grundrisse, except for two extracts, the introduction of 57 and the big text sur les formes qui précèdent la production capitaliste that Althusser had made, translated by a participant in the seminar. So all the problematic on which Tony Negri had grounded himself, and more generally that I would consider today like the bifurcation of Marx into the theorization of the surplus value and surplus labor, kind of escaped Althusser. And he's actually working on that right now. So hopefully we'll have a text that we can add to the page. Yeah. So yeah. Let me see. But again, yeah. I mean, again, I think there would be some fascinating work. I mean, Stuart, don't you know? Like, no, who was no? I mean, no.
No. I mean that genuinely was the question.
Okay.
I don't know
okay.
Negri's work well enough to be able to contextualize, but I'm trying to think of what I know about France in that period and what might have been going on as a context. But it's not something that I know an answer to that I can then unveil as a surprise.
Right. Okay. All right. Good. Do you want to pass the mic down, or Guillaume?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a question more for perhaps for Michael. I was very, very interested by your reference on the 17th movements, devoted to this critics of labor and the necessity to go beyond work. And I was wondering, because it's always a question that I have also in mind, I was wondering how could we interpret this affirmation and the value that I take for granted of going beyond work today. I was thinking in France of this documentation on attention, danger, travail, explaining a lot of things regarding precarious jobs and so on. And it seemed to be particularly clear that in the 70s, there was this question of activity you spoke on. I was thinking of André Gor's work, Critique de la division du travail, 1973, explaining that we need to go to a concept of activity going beyond this division of labor. So, but of course, nowadays, can we still maintain this exteriority of activity? Because we can think that, for example, all the activities of care go in this direction, but in fact, we know now that it involves a kind of labor that must be recognized. So, how do you deal now with this question to go with this necessity to go beyond labor regarding the reality of precariousness, precarious movements, and so on? Thank you very much.
You want to take that? Oh, yeah, sure. Great.
No, that's super interesting. I think, well, okay. I mean, on one hand, I feel like the refusal of work as a tactic and as a concept seems today as alive as it certainly was in the 70s. I mean, just as a matter of that work sucks. I mean, it's just a so anyway, just the refusal of work as a program rather than the celebration of work seems to me something that's almost become more generalized in the last 50 years. What I would and so then there's a second element that you're pointing to, maybe more important, is the necessity of opening class struggle to forms of activity beyond the conventional wage labor, so that the precarious, that forms of undocumented migrant labor, those who don't have access directly to the traditional forms of class struggle, opening it to them. That also seems to me something that is definitely perhaps more clear today than it was then. But then you're pointing to something that's more difficult, which is that seemingly forms of non-work, of life activity, are by certain kinds of platforms, et cetera, are that the value they produce is captured even outside of a labor relationship. And how to refuse that and contest that seems a challenge. But that's a good proposition. I just wanted, though, to go back to part of what Sandro was saying. I mean, that one of the things that I was interested in those passages in the Grundrisse, and Sandro is pointing out with Tony's general approach, which is to recognize the forms of wealth that we already have. And maybe, like I was wondering when you were saying it, if even more so today, when it seems like we are at a point of absolute impotence, that recognizing that the forms of the creation of wealth are really something that we already possess, and that the basis of revolutionary activity can be on those on the forms of wealth that we already have. I mean, so I do think a little bit in this discussion that the terms get confusing, like using the term labor, and because often when we say labor, it's assumed we're talking about forms of wage labor, established forms of work. But then when you were quoting these passages, I mean, I guess you could say living labor was one way of trying to distinguish it, non-objectified labor, human activity. That is, I mean, that's another thing that Marx was doing in some of these passages. I guess how to recognize the forms of wealth we have that are outside of even the relationship with capital. That would be. I mean, I do think maybe it's useless to say. I mean, it's hard at a time like now to have what you call it, this kinds of political recommendations, because of it just seems that the situations are so dire. But the I don't know, just one methodological one that you were emphasizing seems useful to me in this regard. As I would put it in terms of the forms of wealth that we are in control of and that we create, that are not even captured by capital, is a way of starting it. But okay, Guillaume, I went a little bit beyond what Guillaume was asking, but I was trying to jump back with Sandro, not quite successfully, but I'm trying. Yeah.
Do you want to jump in, Sandro?
Just a couple of words. the question you raise is very important today. We confront a capitalism in which the extraction of value outside of the relation between capital and labor plays a more and more important role. I mean, so we were talking a couple of weeks ago about rent as a kind of conceptual figure that allows to grasp the panoply of forms of extraction from human activity and not through direct exploitation of labor. Platforms are a good instance, but also processes of urban extraction of value are a good instance. So the kind of wager is to put together such forms of extraction of value with other forms where extraction takes on a literal meaning. Extraction of minerals, mining projects, and so on. If you map all these forms together, remaining aware of their heterogeneity, you get a quite impressive picture of the relevance of what we tentatively can call rent in contemporary capitalism.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, some thoughts on that, but let's go to another question here. Would you want to present yourself?
Sure. Hi, can you see me? My name is Patricia. Thank you so much for the introduction and for your interventions. I'm interested in picking up on a thread that Sandro presented connecting Negri and Dussel. And in particular, I mean, I'm less familiar with Negri, so I'm interested more if you could say about living labor, totality, and this idea that Dussel takes from living labor, which is that there is an exteriority to totality. And it's a meaningful exteriority for the transition for revolutionary subjectivity. And of course, for Dussel, the source isn't just living labor taken from the Grundrisse and other drafts of Capital, but also a phenomenological strand in Levinas and the other, and an engagement, and well, he is really establishing also decolonial theory and thinking about meaningfully different cultural forms and forms of life that coexist within capitalism. So I'm wondering if that features in Negri's work, because Negri is foregrounding the totality. He is not really wanting to say, I take it, that there is anything meaningfully outside of that totality of social capital. Nevertheless, he's making this point that living labor is important, that there are plural forms of human activity. I mean, all the stuff that you guys were talking about, pleasure and human needs, the universal human needs, that go far beyond what bourgeois society sort of establishes. Yeah, so my question is, does Negri ever make use of this category of exteriority in that more Dusselian sense? Or is there some other kind of idea present? I know exteriority also is not a popular idea among many Marxists, but I think that there's an opening in Negri in this way that we're talking about, especially with the political and political reading. So, yeah, is it relevant for him?
I'll say a couple things. I mean, but I like this. I mean, I like the connection you're making, and it does seem to me there are many points of intersection. Well, I think first, I mean, I think the one of them would be thinking about excess or the like that there's always an excess, like, so Tony, I can think of a number of works where he's doing it when he's insisting that there is no measure, like that the measure of capital can never contain the wealth of living labor, of human activity, et cetera. And I think I would read that as, you could translate that into Dussell's exteriority to totality. I mean, if one thinking about capitalist world as a totality itself, and that this is exterior to it, this immeasurability of, or always excessive, capital can capture a certain amount of, and translate into capitalist value, a certain amount of the kinds of social production that we involve, but only part of it. There's always an excess. And that excess is the point, like a point from which to struggle against it. But I would even translate it into, I mean, this is what, I think this is true that when, I think this is true when Tony and I were working on rent, the passage from profit to rent, so that this, which Sandro was talking about, in some ways what that is trying to interpret as the shift within the composition of total social capital from industrial production being at its core to industrial production now being in some ways secondary to other forms of production that function through rent. I think that rent, the production of wealth is always exterior to rent. I mean, that's what the profit tries to name the expropriation of value that's under the control and direction of the capitalist. The cooperation of the factory is always under the rule of the capitalist, something like that. Whereas rent is what's produced, also in its pre-capitalist forms. Rent is the extraction of value from production that happens outside of the capitalist control. And so that's a way of thinking also, I think, about platforms, about all the things that Sandro was talking about. So there is certainly a nefarious face of this. All of these, and I think what Guillaume was pointing to in a way. But maybe just in typical fashion of the way Tony and I talk to each other, like that also points toward the possibility of a separation. That rent points to the fact that production is happening elsewhere and even tendentially autonomously organized, and that has a potential. I see that as related to the Dussell's ideas. I mean, someone also better would try to do a liberation theology connection between Tony and Dussell, which would also be an interesting another matter, but. I'll leave that one aside. Did you want to go with that one? No. Okay.
Daniel?
Yeah. You've just clarified something that confused me earlier in your remarks, where you talked about class struggle first and industrial worker struggle, because if you go beyond the notion of industrial worker, it would seem, well, like when we think about wages for housework, that struggle occurs in every realm, and that's certainly suggested by the Grundrisse. And if you think about class as mediating all social relations rather than Althusser's determining all social relations, then we have a place to reinscribe activity and meaning beyond capital, that capital is constantly trying to attach the commodity form to all those relationships. But I think that so often we confuse class struggle with just industrial work. And how do we, given all the new forms of value that have developed since the 70s, reconceptualize class struggle in all those realms?
No, that was great. I think it was a comment more than a question, maybe.
Well,
but,
I guess I'm asking
okay.
Both of you, it sounds like you've thought about some ways in the current conjuncture, and the reason why I think it's important to think about that stuff is identitarian politics rather than saying that class struggle is relevant, to suggest that activity be disconnected from class relations, and that activity of these various identity groups and pleasure can be understood outside without analyzing the way in which capital attempts to enter those relationships. So I just think we need to think about that stuff.
Yeah, no, totally right.
Okay.
Yeah. I can say one thing about it, just as a thing, which I think the beginning of a concept of multitude for me and Tony had two levels. One was about the multiplicity of the working class, that the contemporary composition of the working class is multiple and can't be represented as a unity, so that when we think about class struggle, we have to think about Amazon workers and informal labor and all kinds of other, and wages for housework can fit in as a kind of spur to go down that road. But then also a heterogeneity of struggles that aren't only directed at capital. I mean, the plurality of the structures of domination, so that there's both a heterogeneity within the working class and a heterogeneity that the working class is part of. And so that seemed to us whatever the conditions that we're trying to name, by that, but then naming the conditions is only the beginnings of the concept. Then you have to organize it. Like, it has to be organized into a political actor. And that's the challenging part, that's what it means as a project. That's maybe the harder project, is to then say, how can such a multiplicity, or I was even saying two-leveled multiplicity, how can we make that into political, a source of political action, or a actor, or something like that? You were ready to go on that, weren't you?
No, just a footnote. I mean, you mentioned the wages for housework campaign, and that campaign was really important in challenging, the boundaries of productive labor. And in the following decades, feminism has been crucial in continuing to deepen this kind of challenge to the boundaries of labor. I mean, I think of social reproduction theory, of course, but I also think of the feminist strike in different parts of the world over the last years that has taken as its aim precisely to organize the unorganizable, And these are crucially important experiences. Having said this, if we continue to speak of class, as I think we should, class also raises the problem of a dividing line, of a line of division that crosses society, and that reorganizes the heterogeneity that Marco was discussing right now, without deleting it. And this is the big wager, the big challenge.
Thank you, Sandro. Sergio Grossi in the front row.
Thank you for this discussion. I want to ask what you think that are the more pressing, the new horizon of liberation nowadays in this time. And then I was thinking also if you have some reflection about, for example, the pandemic on loneliness, the mental health crisis that affect the society that you have already taken in after COVID and then still present, and maybe some reflection about the mass incarceration process and the question of the prison inside our society and in America, but also in Latin America, that is very strong, that they create new form of subjectivity like gangs that are like sometimes political actor and sometimes like organized neighborhood prison and so on. What do you think that are the other maybe? Thank you.
That's hard.
You know, this is a crucial question. We all share the awareness of its importance. We all ask this question every day. Maybe my tentative reply is a bit kind of displacing, because I think we have to take seriously the fact that we are facing a new form of fascism in many parts of the world. And so we have to confront this new form of fascism. We have to make sense of it, of the way it works, and we have to confront it. And for me, the big challenge is doing that without limiting ourselves to a position of mere resistance, as I was saying before, which means that we should be able to map and connect the different movements, the different forms, you know, of practice and behavior that exist in our society and that refuse fascism. From this mapping, maybe from this cognitive mapping, to quote Fred Jameson, maybe you know, a positive political project can emerge.
I mean, it is true. One has to admit that the most inspiring movements of the last few years in the world are at the present moment, at least the ones that I've focused on, at a low point. I mean, Ni Una Menos in Argentina facing Milei is certainly a difficult moment. Women Life Freedom movement in Iran had setbacks. The Kurdish liberation movement in Rojava is in deep difficulty. The Kurdish liberation movement in Turkey too is in question. So it's, but I wouldn't say that it's not like, let's see. It's easier to answer that question when we could say, okay, well, let's look at this one and this one and this one that are so inspiring right now. Somehow what Sandro was proposing maybe doesn't rest on being able to point to the strength of those liberation movements at the moment. But I don't know. Just recognize myself that what my habitual response has always been to say, okay, but what's going on? You know, look at all these things that are going on. There's a kind of incipient internationalism that we can recognize that poses an alternative.
It would be too easy.
It would be too easy, okay. Yes, that would be. If communism were that easy, we would have already won. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Okay, I've got two more questions. One over here.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Enrico. I'm actually a historian, so I hope you will forgive me for my pessimism, first of all, and then second,
is that a disciplinary danger?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. So yeah, and if I will, you know, sort of pick up on your initial question to historicize, I particularly love the fact that you focus this on how Tony Negri tried to integrate Marx into his era, and now I think the question I want to ask is how to integrate this and the Grundrisse now as well. And I was particularly captured by the passage you've read about kind of the wealth, labor as wealth, and then bourgeois, removing the bourgeois element in this.
Yeah.
And this is where I guess the historic pessimism comes in, and I ask, where we had, at the point we're at right now, and I'm referring specifically, I think, to works like Byung-Chul Han's or Slavoj Žižek's, it seems to me that my question is, was enjoyment, pleasure that we so mentioned here captured already by bourgeois society? I'm thinking, but we mentioned Althusser here. Althusser engaged also with Lacan. Is this kind of the negative of this enjoyment that Marx was speaking of displeasure, some sort of, surplus jouissance? I don't know. I hope this is clear enough.
The fact of such things being captured by capital doesn't seem to me to negate their power. Or maybe I would come back to with the Dussel question that there's always an exteriority to it, or there's always a surplus or a excess or an overflowing, that is not captured. So I don't know. I mean, I can't give the proper psychoanalytic response, which I think you were looking towards, which I'm incapable of. But I don't know. It might be, in fact, it might be to relate it back to Guillaume's notion that, or proposition, that a variety of new forms of capitalist capture are entering new domains. Maybe put it that way. Things that seemed outside of capital's purview of now are being, they've found ways of producing value with it. I mean, I don't know, stupid old examples like Facebook or, certain kind of social media that it seemed like, friendship now can become productive of value or something like that. But that's the way capital's always been. It's always been great at finding new domains to capture. I guess we have to. It doesn't lead to the. Doesn't necessarily lead to pessimism, in my view. Because what? Because it. Well, there's two. It should be. Like here's the properly operaisti response, which is that in the fact that. This is the famous Tronti line, Maru Tronti line, that worker struggles precede and prefigure the development of capital. The fact that this happens demonstrates that the source of power, the source of innovation, the real is with worker struggle. And so in the same way, the fact that things are, that new forms of value are captured, maybe you could read that as pointing towards that we have had that wealth all along, like valorizing the wealth itself, valorizing and not in the capitalist sense, valorizing meaning like recognizing its power, and that it could then be transformed, used differently. Okay, not a great response, but I'm getting where you're going with it.
I think we definitely need to invoke some more kind of Tony spirit here of the optimism of the will somehow. In this conversation, he's
wine.
missing.
Wine. Tony's the spirit.
Would be wine.
White wine.
Yes.
Right. Okay. All right. Jack Ruiz.
Thank you. Just one question. Today, y'all talked a lot about the term value, and nowadays in the common lexicon, we use words that every human has value, and we also use ideas that you need to invest in yourself in order to kind of reach some aspect of self-actualization. Do you think we can use those words that are really like within like this economic framework of like value investment. Can those ever be used outside of that economic framework, or are they just further reinforcements of humans as just basically resource allocators, etc.?
So let's have a punctual response to that, and then some closing thoughts. Okay, some final closing thoughts. But let's address the question.
So the
and
punctual response is that value has always had different meanings, economic and ethical. Nowadays, I think that the economic meaning is overwhelming. And so there is indeed a risk that also when you say that every human being has value, you are kind of using the economic notion of value.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a kind of a process of colonization analogous to the one of capture.
You're going to be able to do that on there? You can do that? Can you do it? Okay, actually, we have one person on Zoom who has a question, and so let's take that, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay? So it's Tom Walker. Hold on for a second. Can you hear us, Tom Walker? We can't hear you yet. You need to unmute. Actually, we have one person on Zoom who has a question, and so let's take that, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay? So it's Tom Walker.
Thank you.
Hold on for a second. Can you hear us, Tom Walker? We can't hear you yet. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me through there?
Yep. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, you can hear me on Zoom, but not in the room.
No, we can hear you in the room. We can hear you in the room.
Just with
Can you make him, highlight him, pin him?
But there is a delay. There is a delay, so you cannot see. You will see in 2 minutes.
No, we can hear you in the room. We can hear you in the room.
High technology here.
But there is a delay. There is a delay, so you cannot see.
I'm nothing great to look at, so you don't need to see me. The question that I have goes back to Tony Negri's matter of refusal of work, also to wealth, and am I being heard? Or do I go around in circles? Okay, and the widening of the circle of pleasure. Okay, so on page 398 of Grundrisse, there is this stunning paragraph, one sentence of which is almost incomprehensible. The whole development of wealth rests on the creation of disposable time. I see disposable time as very clearly related to refusal of work.
98. Oh, 398, 390, sorry. Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Now,
Whole development of creation of
Marx gives this phrase of disposable time from an 1821 pamphlet, The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, which he quotes extensively from, both on the preceding page, page 397, and extensively in Notebook 7.
Okay.
I'm particularly interested in the influence that the pamphlets had on Marx, and indirectly William Godwin's work on Marx, and relating to the widening of the sphere of pleasures. There's a sentence in William Godwin's work which that echoes very muchly, ending talking about enlarging our stock of knowledge, refining our taste, and the opening to us new and more exquisite sources of enjoyment. These are in hours that are not required for the production of the necessities of life. It seems to me that both the pamphlet, the 1821 pamphlet, and Godwin's work really throw a lot of light on what Marx is doing in the Grundrisse. He goes far beyond what the pamphlet says or what Godwin says, but it's hard to know how far beyond he goes without looking back at those sources. And I'm wondering whether yourselves have looked at these sources at all, and if you have any comments on the relationship between the 1821 pamphlet, William Godwin's advocacy of leisure for all, and Marx's discussion of disposable time in the Grundrisse.
Okay. Can you turn off the sound then? Thanks. Okay, well, look, you know, it's 2025, still struggling with technology, but we try as hard as we can to bring everybody into the conversation. Do you want to say a word?
No, I mean, maybe I think it's just revealing that I'm a bad scholar because I've not read the pamphlet, 1821 pamphlet that he's referring to. The Godwin's is interesting, the connection to the Godwin, and I think, but those, I agree that would be a useful way of approaching this, looking more closely at these sources that Marx is reading. I mean, Marx's readings, of course, are voluminous, you know, so it's a large project to do that. But with the Godwin, I mean, I think that would be an interesting way of characterizing this. I could see, I mean, I'd have to think more about how much the influence is extending, if that's a way of characterizing the political perspective of the Grundrisse. I'm attracted by that. But I don't.
Good.
It does seem like also a textual question that I'm not prepared for.
All right. Okay, so let's maybe have some final thoughts before we go have a drink. Sandro, you want to close?
Yeah.
And then Michael?
Yeah.
You know,
If I had.
I repeat that it is worth reading the Grundrisse, rereading sections of that work, and I continue to be convinced, as I was saying at the very beginning, that we should use the Grundrisse as a lens to rereading Capital. And the question of class struggle writ large. Class struggle is a concept that we need to reinvent. I think that the question of class struggle is really important in attempting to do this translation of the Grundrisse onto Capital. Let's put it so. A question that continues to resonate is the one on Dussel. As far as I am concerned, I would try to reply to this question from the point of view of the other concept I briefly discussed with respect to the Grundrisse, which means the concept of the world market, you know. And I think that if we take seriously this idea of a dialectic between limit and obstacle, then we also have the possibility to challenge any rigid understanding of capital as a totality, you know. And of course, the encounter with the limit in the fabrication of the world market is in a way always the encounter with an outside that takes different forms, different meanings, but remains at least relatively exterior to capital. And so, yes, it's a very good question, and I will continue to think about it.
Thank you, Sandro.
I had just one little idea, which was that, you know, one of the principles of operaísmo is about the need to conduct an inquiries about the composition of the working class, with the assumption that we never know what the working class is. Every time you think you know, you have to actually go out and do an investigation to see what the working class really is. And I was wondering if we could translate that maybe for this seminar to Marx's work too. Like that, in order to read, like, and I think that's something what Tony's book is trying to do with the Grundrisse, is to help us unlearn the Marx we've been taught. And that in some ways we have to recognize that we don't know Marxism, and that re-engaging with Marx is a kind of, that there has to be a constant relearning. I'm thinking, yeah, like I said, sort of an analogy to the recognition that we don't know what the working class is, and that we have to do that sort of an investigation. Clearing out the official Marxism that we thought we knew, to be able to discover, yeah, something beneath it. That's the only idea I had.
And perhaps to find another term or to interrogate the term working class at this point, right, itself. Right. All right, well, I think that we've had an extraordinary lesson on the Grundrisse. So thank you very much, Sandro. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all of you, for coming out. Thank you, Ricardo, for all the organization. Thank you, Reno, for all the AV work, exceptional AV work. And we meet again next week, same time, same channel, March 12th, Wednesday, March 12th. We'll be reading Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism with Cornel West. So I invite you back, and everyone here, let's go across the street to the arts and crafts and have a drink together, okay? Wonderful, thanks. And so, yeah, so